Why would we assume that empathy is like intrinsically human and only derivatively not human? And
what happens if there's a leader that exhibits zero empathy?
Alpha males range in their personality characteristics, and many times more despotic males, they manage through bullying to just stay on top of the dominance hierarchy. Somehow, the entire group culture had changed after these males had died off, and that when you studied the same group of baboons, many generations later, more tolerant social culture still existed. So it's an incredible natural experiment in what can happen when these bullies are removed from that social group. The energy of one person can shift it all. I find that very fascinating and both deeply hopeful and scary.
Welcome to the Brad Carr podcast. My guest is Dr. Christine Webb, Harvard-trained primatologist, professor at New York University, and the author of The Arrogant Ape, The Myth of Human Exceptionalism and Why It Matters. And in this episode, we discuss her research on conflict in non-human primates and what it tells us about handling conflict in our own lives. Dr. Christine Webb, in your fieldwork, what have you learned about aggression in non-human primates?
So every primate society has different kinds of aggression, and aggression serves various functions. But in the wild Chekma baboons that I've worked with, for instance, who have very strict dominance hierarchies, aggression serves to manage conflicts of interests and deal with social disruptions and social tensions and disagreements that can arise. And aggression is a big part of their social life. What I've been especially interested in is what happens after aggression. How do they manage and mitigate these conflicts of interest and repair the kind of damage that aggression might cause to a relationship? And baboons and many other primate species are known to engage in a behavior called reconciliation, which serves that restorative function. So after aggression, they come together again in a friendly way, not all the time, but sometimes. And this seems to restore the relationship to baseline levels of tolerance and affiliation.
How does that work? Like, what does it look like? Maybe could you walk us through an example of the aggression and the reconciliation?
Yeah. So the aggression can be directed from and to many different kinds of individuals, but let's just take a common example of a high-ranking, dominant male Chekma baboon directing aggression to, let's say, an adolescent male baboon. And the aggression can be physical, it can be non-physical, so there can be these kinds of non-physical threats or even displacements where in baboon society, sort of spatial politics and proximity is really important. So if you have a baboon in one location and then a higher ranking individual approaches, that baboon will often get displaced so that higher ranking baboon can have priority access to whatever resource was right there. But aggression can also take a very physical form, a more violent form. It can be chasing, it can be tugging, it can be biting, hitting, slapping. So there's various forms of physical aggression, just as there are various forms of reconciliation. So what sometimes happens after a physical or even a non-physical aggressive interaction is that the animals will come together again in a friendly way. They might start grooming one another. They might touch one another in an affiliative manner. Chimpanzees will actually do this mouth-to-mouth kissing behavior that is really identifiable to us as human beings. It looks as if they're kissing, or they'll even put their mouth on the body of their former opponent. And we've done studies to show that this behavior does indeed serve a reparative function, that it seems to restore the relationship to some previous level of interaction and trust. And that is why it deserves this functional label of reconciliation.
Mm-hmm. And in your book, The Arrogant Ape, too, you wrote that you've experienced this, that they've approached you as well?
I believe I certainly have been the target of aggression.
Mm-hmm.
That is often just a part of working with wild animals and living among them. And I believe I've been a target of reconciliation as well, after a particularly profound instance where a young male baboon, I believe, had to kind of make amends for an aggressive interaction that had kind of gotten out of hand the day before.
How did it make amends?
Yeah, so this happened after a mobbing event with one of my colleagues where this young male baboon named Bear, who was being a very typical young male baboon insofar as he was causing a lot of trouble both with his group members, the other baboons he lived among, and also with the team of human field researchers who was following him. So he was always like pushing his boundaries. He would like jump out of trees and surprise us and slap our legs and steal our GPS systems and just, be very cheeky. And one day his antics got out of hand. So I was in the field with a colleague, and we're not sure exactly what instigated the mobbing event, but that Bear was clearly involved. He was sort of at the center of it all. And all of a sudden, all these baboons kind of unexplainably surrounded her, and they started barking really loudly, and they were slapping her legs, and they were hitting her, and she was terrified. And I was terrified watching it. I was maybe 10 feet away from her.
Mhm.
And fortunately, it didn't escalate to a point where she or anybody got seriously injured, but it was psychologically really challenging. And it escalated to the point where we really weren't sure we were going to continue following the troop, or we thought maybe we should just give this a break and keep some distance from them. Nonetheless, we decided to keep following the troop, but just at a much, much greater distance. So the next day I was with the same troop of baboons, but I was staying very far away. I had to sort of watch them through my binoculars, and in the hopes that the kind of tension that seemed to be mounting would dissipate a bit. And at one moment in the afternoon, I was in a very precarious position. I was sort of wobbling down this steep, rocky incline, and over the ridge, I see Bear coming.
Mm.
This time he's making a beeline for me, and he has this entourage of other baboons right behind him. And I was terrified. I really thought, okay, now my time has come.
Yeah.
They're going to attack me. And I couldn't really get out of their way because of the position I was in. And so I just did everything I could to remain as calm as possible on the surface, even though deep down, my heart was racing, my palms were sweaty. And Bear got closer and closer, and he approached. And as he got right up next to me, he put his hand in between my hiking boots, and he looked up at me, and he bared his teeth into this very awkward, forced grimace. And I remember it so clearly because I had never seen baboon teeth that up close before, and they were so white and like perfectly square. They almost looked like dentures.
Huh.
And,
What does the grimace look like? Is it like a fake smile, like when we smile but we don't show our eyes, or it's just showing all the teeth like this?
yes,
Huh. Like you do at the dentist.
precisely.
Yeah.
And it was surreal because I had never had a baboon do that gesture to me. And as a primatologist, I know that this is actually a pacifying gesture. This is something that they do to reconcile with one another. It's something that they do to show their friendly intentions with another baboon. So in that moment, I believe that Bear had to be experiencing some form of empathy. He knew that I was afraid, even though I was doing everything I could possibly do to not appear frightened. And I believe he also had to know what I knew about what had happened the day before. I think he had to know that things had maybe gotten out of hand the previous day, and he was attempting to make amends. This is a capacity that scientists call theory of mind, the ability to kind of know and understand what another knows. And I had been taught throughout graduate school that humans were unique in this capacity, that other animals did not have a theory of mind. In that moment, Bear really challenged that assumption. He suggested to me, okay, not only did he have theory of mind, but he had it for a member of another species. And what gives me even more confidence in my interpretation of that situation is that there have been studies since then that have shown that other primates are capable of having a theory of mind. And this was one of my sort of early experiences as a primatologist, really questioning that supposed boundary between human and animal that our close primate relatives often straddle so well.
I want to get more into all that, the empathy and everything, and what really makes us unique. But hearing all this, so he brought others with him to witness it as well. What's going on there, or could it be that they were pressuring him, saying, "You're the bad guy. You need to go kind of fix this now? Like sometimes parents will make a kid apologize for something.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about the role of the other group members. My
Hmm.
sense is that, the baboons, they're often traveling together and they were kind of moving together as a group, and that Bear was kind of in the front. And Bear and I had sort of a history of interactions where he had caused trouble, played tricks on me and things, and had never reconciled. And I sensed that this was really kind of more of an interaction between Bear and me. I don't get the sense that other baboons with him pressured or encouraged him to do anything. It seemed very much a kind of self-motivated
Hmm.
behavior and interaction.
I'm curious about the sincerity of apologies. A lot of my show is talking about things that people will do, deception and things like that.
Mm,
But first, you seem to have a very confident sense that you can understand these animals. For those who don't know just how intense your experience is and what sort of feedback loop you're in, what is it like and how do you develop that confidence in your read on them?
Yeah, and I mean, I should just caveat that I can never be absolutely sure what is going on in the mind of a baboon, what precisely motivates them, just as I can never be sure what is going on in the mind and the intentions of another human being.
Yep.
In a similar fashion, the way that I think we come to that understanding with our fellow humans is through entering into relationships that are based on mutual accommodation and trust, like really getting to know who this other person is and like what their intentions are. And again, it's not a foolproof way of always saying, okay, I know with absolute certainty what is happening here, but that over time you can get a sense for what behaviors mean certain things. Language is this supposed cognitive Rubicon that's thought to separate humans from other animals. And we can get into that. But I think of language as just another behavior. Like it's another form of indirect evidence for what is going on in somebody's mind. It's not this like direct channel or tunnel into what their thoughts and feelings and goals are. It's just another form of indirect evidence like body language, like facial expressions. And all of these indirect sources of evidence, vocalizations, our relationship, the history and context and patterning of interactions, facial expressions, body language, which is called a language for a reason. We can use all of these cues to reach a better and better approximation of what can be going on in the other individual's mind when they engage in a certain act like this.
Yeah, that language is this, as you said, cognitive Rubicon is funny to me because so much of what I talk about in the show is how people use language to hurt other people
Yeah.
and how you can deceive people. The most deceptive and dangerous people are often master storytellers. And
Mm,
so they can spin stories around situations, get people caught up in things, get people believing other things with language. But then if you're targeted by someone like that, often as humans, we still have a funny gut feeling about that person, or what one of the people who I just talked to yesterday describes as a lingering upset effect. It's almost like the residue of a
mm,
bad gut feeling. When you
mm,
deal with someone who's a good actor, but maybe you have a disagreement or something, it probably doesn't keep you up at night for a long time. But you deal
mhm.
with someone who's a bad actor, and you might be thinking about that a week later, a month later, and we have these sort of other senses. So to get into how much you sense with these animals too, like how much time are you spending? How close are you together? How much observation is there? Because again, with humans, we think we know somebody if we've gone out to dinner a couple times and maybe somebody looked them up on Instagram or Facebook and said, well, no, I kind of know who they are and what they're about. But how much do you know these animals?
Yeah, so these particular baboons I had been with for a couple of months at least, and this was not the first field season that I had been with them. And we know them as individuals. So
Mm,
there's long-term historical data on, okay, who these individuals are, who their families are, and we know them over time collecting social behavioral data throughout their lives. So there is this sort of like longitudinal approach that we take. When the field season is in session, you're typically with the baboons from dawn until dusk.
wow.
So you go to their sleeping site in the morning, otherwise you wouldn't be able to find them, and you spend the entire day with them until they go to a different sleeping site at night, and then you know the next morning where to find them. Otherwise, who knows where they could be, and we're in the desert, and there's hundreds, thousands of kilometers. It would be impossible to cover otherwise. So you're with them all day. You're actually in very close proximity to them because these are habituated baboons. They're habituated to human observers and presence. That's not always the case, right? That is a process. That is an ongoing process, often a mutual process of the baboons gaining trust or not being perturbed by humans, and the humans having to change their behaviors in a certain way to be able to move freely in the baboons' midst. It's a really interesting process, the whole process of habituation. I've only been a part of it a few times. And so you get to know these animals as individuals. I've also worked with Chacma baboons in other contexts, so I sort of have a kind of like general species knowledge or population level knowledge that develops in these different contexts, but a species level knowledge about their behavioral repertoires, like what these different behaviors indicate, what kinds of social relationships to expect, what their kind of group structure looks like, et cetera. So there's various sources of data. And then, of course, there's the literature itself, on the scientific literature on baboon behavior and lifestyles that most primatologists, who work with these animals become quite familiar with.
So you bring your expertise from your training and all of that, and then you go into the wild. You're with them for months at a time and watching them literally all day, from when they wake to when they sleep. And you said in very close proximity. How close are we talking?
Depends, but you're walking freely in their midst, so it could be a matter of feet away. I mean, as I said,
Yeah.
there is hand between my hiking boots. They touch us sometimes. It's not ideal, but it happens. And I should add, it's not every single day. You need a break. So, you may
Okay.
you have maybe 2 or 3 days in the field, 1 day off, 2 or 3 days in the field, 1 day off.
Yeah. So it's just a tremendous amount of connection. I mean, to think of us as animals too. I mean, as animals, to be around other animals, to see what they're doing all the time, thinking about what they're doing, observing everything they do, and even a little bit of contact, touch. With that, how confident are you that they have empathy? I guess, do you still have doubts?
No, I have very little. I mean, I shouldn't generalize about all baboons having a certain amount of empathy in the same way that I don't think we should generalize about all humans having
Sure.
a certain amount of empathy, but that they certainly have the capacity for empathy. I have very little doubt about that. Not only do they show forms of empathy with each other, and I think we can maybe get into the various ways that can manifest, but I think in my interaction with Bear, I believe that they can also have empathy for other primates and other forms of life too, perhaps.
Wow. You said you'd like to maybe get into other ways that they show it? I'd be very interested.
Yeah, so I mentioned reconciliation before, which are these friendly reunions between former opponents. The best behavioral marker that we have for empathy in the animal kingdom is actually a related behavior called consolation, which is when, after a conflict between two individuals, a third party, an uninvolved bystander of that conflict, they weren't involved, they just saw it, will come and approach one of the opponents, often the victim of the aggression, who is like showing perhaps signs of distress, and they will offer some kind of comforting contact to that individual. It might look a little bit like reconciliation. It's not with the former opponent, it's with someone else. And we know from a number of different studies across species that this behavior occurs most often amongst close social partners. So the more you are close friends or relatives with the victim of the conflict, the more likely you are to offer this behavior. We know that it actually serves a stress relieving function on behalf of the recipient. So whoever receives it actually does seem to sort of calm down. And that the behavior is regulated by a hormone called oxytocin, which we know plays a really important role in empathic bonding and interactions. And so all of these bits of evidence give us pretty good sense that consolation behavior is motivated by empathy. In my view, that is actually the most parsimonious explanation for the behavior. It's the explanation we would give if we saw a young kid doing it to another kid who was upset.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that it's always categorically motivated by empathy. I mean, just going back to what you were saying before, I can imagine certain times when the behavior is deployed a bit more strategically or for other purposes. But I believe the most sort of straightforward explanation that's relying on an evolutionarily continuous explanation with humans would be to say that it is driven by empathy.
So in your book, you get into some of the logic of different arguments about comparing animals and humans. How would you see the logical question there of, can we say that if we would judge this way in a couple of children, that we should judge it similarly between two monkeys?
As scientists, we're often taught something called, it's a version of the parsimony principle. It's called Morgan's canon. It's essentially like you should never invoke a higher mental or psychological explanation for a behavior when a simpler explanation will suffice. And that is a principle that I learned in college and in graduate school, and it was sort of inculcated into me many, many times. And what my mentor, this primatologist named Francois, did, I think, quite successfully is he showed that there's different ways of thinking about parsimony. So we can think about cognitive parsimony, which is like always reduce whatever you're seeing to the simplest possible explanation. It can't be empathy. It has to just be like some physiological selfish need to calm oneself down or whatever. That would be like approaching it from it's just an instinct. There's nothing actually happening here. It's automatic and purely selfish. That's one way of thinking about parsimony. But what Francois did is he said, we could also think about something called evolutionary parsimony, not cognitive parsimony, evolutionary parsimony, which suggests that the most straightforward, simplest explanation is often to assume evolutionary continuity between humans and other species. So that when I'm saying, if we would say that that behavior that looks a lot like empathy is empathy in children, then actually the most parsimonious explanation would be to say it's empathy in our closest living primate relatives. And to explain it otherwise would be to be doing all sorts of weird mental gymnastics to like try to reduce it. And he called, just the last thing I'll say is that the sort of first version of cognitive parsimony is meant to protect against anthropomorphism, the sort of tendency to like falsely project human-like qualities onto other species. What Franz de Waal coined was this sort of opposing term called anthropodenial, which is the tendency to reject commonalities between us and other species when in fact those commonalities really do exist. And so I think, and I've been trained in his legacy and in his lineage, and so I very much think a lot, not just about, anthropomorphism, but the very concerning kind of complementary bias of anthropodenial.
How do you sort of thread that? How do you decide which you're sort of leaning toward or where the right ground is?
Well, certainly for our closest living primate relatives whose behavior we really identify with. I mean, they have similar body plans. They have similar perceptual abilities, similar life histories. Like there's all these commonalities, and we're evolutionarily so proximate to them that I certainly believe it's justifiable to sort of veer more towards assuming similarity, right? Not worrying as much about anthropomorphism, which is another term that maybe we can unpack later because I think it comes with a lot of baggage that is not super helpful. And that the concern of anthropodenial is sort of more top of mind for me. I'm less resistant to this sort of notion of drawing comparisons between humans and other animals. For species who are more distantly related to human beings and who lead these radically different lives, who have totally different perceptual and sensory worlds and behaviors that are harder to identify with, I believe we need to be more sort of cautious in our interpretations, but that's also just because I don't have experience with those animals. I don't know them as intimately as I know other primates. I think people who study, prairie dogs or wolves or bumblebees or whales, very intimately and carefully would be in a position to sort of know the difference between, okay, when is it a projection of a human-like characteristic and when is it actually just understanding continuity in behavior. I think the other concern with studying very different kinds of species is that, and this is also true of our fellow primates, is that, we're often using a human benchmark for certain things and then comparing other animals against it. Like, why would we assume that empathy is like intrinsically human and only derivatively not human? And what I mean by that is, why is it anthropomorphic to say that another animal has empathy? I don't think that's anthropomorphic necessarily at all. That suggests that humans have this sort of primacy on that capacity. But perhaps it's primatomorphic or mammalomorphic or animalomorphic. It's something that we have in common with many other forms of life. I don't know if that fully got at your question, but that's
it does. It does. One thing I'm curious about, you mentioned that we have similar bodies, which is very apparent. We have similar senses.
Mm.
One thing that I would hear people often raise is, but what about our brains? Aren't our brains much different? Aren't our genes much different?
So human beings actually just have a linearly scaled up primate brain. It's exactly the kind of brain size and structure you would expect for a primate of our size. Genetically, I think the famous statistic is like we're 98.6% similar to these other primates, although those things are often fraught because we're like 70% related to zebrafish and species who uh, are very, very different. But yeah, certainly when it comes to our brains, we've often been on this quest to figure out like what makes the human brain so special. And as one famous neuroscientist said, that quest is sort of like trying to find a needle in a haystack, because every time we think we've found the thing that makes our brain special, other data will come and trouble that conclusion.
In your book, I think you cited the sort of the Yuval Noah Harari argument that, but we built stuff. Like, we're incredible collaborators. We can make cities, we can build businesses, we can have religions. So what about our capacity for that incredible social connection around stories and ideas?
Yeah, so this is an important opportunity to draw the distinction between human uniqueness and human exceptionalism.
Mhm.
So my book is about human exceptionalism. Human, which I'll define in a moment, but human uniqueness is basically just this idea that, okay, humans might have certain capacities, such as our incredible ability to manipulate and control environments or to have these complex cultures, to build civilizations and structures, and that these characteristics might be something that make us distinct from all other forms of life, sort of in aggregate. I think with each of these characteristics, I mean, I know it's not Manhattan, but like beaver dams are pretty incredible and you can see them from space. And unlike our structures, they're actually like working with their environments and the ecology to create sustainable habitats for many other forms of life. So like if we're sort of comparing I don't know how advanced these structures are and how incredible are, again, it sort of depends on what metric we're using. But that aside, in principle, I'm okay with this notion that humans have qualities that distinguish them from other species. So long as we do that for all forms of life, that every species has its own qualities and characteristics that distinguish them from other forms of life. And historically, that sort of quest for human uniqueness has some problems in that many of the characteristics we thought separated humans have been found in other forms of life, or that sort of tendency to emphasize what makes humans so special has often excluded an array of human beings, often those who have already been discriminated against in our society by some way, by saying like, well, not every single human being is able to build in certain ways, right? And does that mean they're not human? Um,
Hmm.
those caveats aside, in principle, I'm fine with this idea that humans are unique. But human exceptionalism is different than human uniqueness, because human exceptionalism suggests that what is distinctive about humans is somehow more morally worthy than the distinctive features of other forms of life, and that we're overall far more evolutionarily advanced than other forms of life. That's a different kind of more normative claim than something like human uniqueness.
Okay. So let's kind of accept empathy then. And you said that maybe empathy varies between the animals that you study, just as it certainly does between humans. What happens in a group of the sort of animals that you study if there's, say, a leader that exhibits zero empathy?
Mm. Yeah, it's a great question, and it again, it really depends on the context and on the species, but certainly alpha males range in their personality
Hmm.
characteristics, and many times the sort of more despotic males, they manage through bullying to just stay on top of the dominance hierarchy. But there are other cases when there will be these sort of like coalitions from below, when lower ranking individuals will gang up on these sort of bully alpha males. But this is not just true of bullies. This might be true of alpha males in general, but that you can have sort of coalitions of other individuals that will attempt to keep the dominant individual's power in check, or actually subvert the hierarchy in some way. Now, what I wanted to share, though, there's this fascinating study about primate culture done by Robert Sapolsky and Baboons, who showed that and I believe it was all of baboons. It was a quite despotic. Do you know this study?
I don't
This
think so. Tell me.
Okay, a very despotic baboon society where there was a lot of aggression and a lot of despotic males. And there was a tuberculosis outbreak in the group. Basically, the baboons found this trash heap of human trash, and there was some tuberculosis transmitted. Now, who was most likely to contract tuberculosis? It was the high-ranking males who had priority access
Mm.
this trash heap. So all of these despotic high-ranking males died. And the group became more tolerant, less aggressive. The title of this study was published in Science years ago, and it's called A Pacifist Culture in Baboons, that somehow the entire sort of group culture had changed after these males had died off, and that when you studied the same group of baboons many generations later, we're talking like multiple generations later, that more tolerant social culture still existed. So it's an incredible kind of natural experiment in what can happen when these bullies are removed from that social group.
Yeah. And with what I know about humans, it's not surprising. I used to be an officer in the military, and you could see how fast having that guy who comes in the most important office of the group, all of a sudden, everything changes. And then a couple years go by, and then he's out, someone else comes in. Things can change so fast. The way that leaders affect culture and the way that it trickles down is remarkable
I see
in
it
humans.
in my department. I
Yeah.
find that interesting how how the energy of one person can shift it all. Just as you were saying, I find that very fascinating and both deeply hopeful and scary
Mm-hmm.
at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
With the animals that you study, is it that sharp? I mean, I'm wondering if maybe with humans, because we have so much leverage socially, that maybe one leader can affect a group more strongly among humans than with animals?
It's a good question. I think it really would depend on the population. I have not ever really witnessed it occurring like in such a overnight way. In the way that also the hierarchy struggles, well, sometimes an individual will die or leave the group, but often, for instance, in the chimpanzees I work with, the sort of hierarchy struggles take place over many days and weeks and sometimes even months, that it's not just like a reversal happens instantly, but that there will be lots of conflicts leading up to it. So that's a little bit harder to gauge the cultural shifts that happen as a result. But I think that would be a very cool thing to study.
Mm, okay. So in situations where this kind of thing could be happening, barring a tuberculosis outbreak, how does the group deal with the despotic leader?
Again, depends on species and population, but often they are subordinate. They subordinate themselves to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Is there anything that they do or specifics? I mean, you mentioned that there can be sort of coalitions. Have you seen anything, or are there specifics in how they actually deal with it?
I mean, in bonobos, another species is a great example of these
Mhm.
coalitions where females will actually band together and behave aggressively towards a male who is acting out of line, who is acting aggressively. So the coalitions can be both, I think, sort of strategic in that they can dictate who can be where in the group and who can groom whom and who can interact with whom. But it can also be very like physically aggressive in challenging that individual and sort of putting them in their place. So I think there's a variety of ways that despotic male leaders can be managed, but in some contexts, either they're not enough of a problem or for whatever reason, there's just not enough motivation to try to overcome them. Rather, better to sort of, in some ways, keeping the peace might mean subordinating
Mhm.
oneself. I mean, this is the way that we talk about dominance hierarchies a lot in other primates is that there are ways of actually avoiding conflict sometimes, which is kind
Yeah.
of confusing, but that they're like ways of creating privileged access to resources. And so that every time there's a potential for conflict, you don't have to duke it out. It's like clear who's going to get what. And so sometimes I could imagine there would be a motivation not to like oust this dominant male leader because doing so would actually disrupt the peace and be more dangerous and threatening to the whole group.
You mentioned females and how they work together. Now, I'm curious about the role of females in these groups. You have a paper titled "The Submissive Pattern of Post-Conflict Affiliation in Asymmetric Relationships: A Test in Male and sexually coerced female baboons. So what is going on with the females, and do they get coerced?
Yeah, so this is coming now back to Chacma baboons again. Always important to attend to this is not talking about all animals in general, but in Chacma baboons, there have been a number of studies by colleagues of mine showing that particularly when they are fertile, when they are sexually receptive, they have these large sexual swellings, and there will be males who spend a lot of time in their proximity who are sort of protecting them from sneaky matings from other group members, and behaving quite aggressively towards them in a way that is thought to kind of force this subordinating behavior to them. And in this paper title that you mentioned, my colleagues and I were sort of trying to tease apart these different reasons for reconciliation behavior. We have all these hypotheses for why it might occur. Is it to restore valuable relationships? Is to communicate benign intent? Or is it to behave submissively to coercive males in some populations and contexts? And we were sort of evaluating the evidence for these different hypotheses and showing that it's not always so straightforward that it's reconciliation, but sometimes it's submission to coercive males.
So many people will probably have heard of mate guarding. So
Mhm.
this sounds like more than mate guarding. This is not only
Right.
keeping the target defended from other males, which in its own way is limiting options for the target and is kind of a manipulation in its own right. But then it's also some sort of pressure directly. How does it all work?
Yeah, so you're right that it goes beyond mere mate guarding. It's part of it. It can be behaving aggressively towards potential intruders,
Mhm.
but that it's also behaving aggressively towards the mate,
Mhm.
towards the female. And that is thought to sort of put her into a more submissive role where she would then be afraid herself to sort of proactively seek out other males.
Mhm. So what does it look like? Does it look like we would see a situation in humans with maybe some violence, with denying resources,
Yeah.
with maybe using children as some sort of bargaining chip? I mean, how does it play out?
I mean, I haven't studied it so extensively.
Okay.
That was my only paper on the behavior, so I don't want to
Okay.
speak to it too much and as if I have a ton of expertise on it. But from what I've seen, it actually can be quite random and spontaneous, the
Hmm.
aggression toward it. So it's, you could imagine that it would be maybe when the female is like going out of sight or interacting with another male. But actually, a lot of the times that I've witnessed it, it's been seemingly random. And I actually think that is maybe interesting in and of itself, that there's sort of like a randomness to it that actually is unpredictable and therefore even more terrifying for the female because it's hard to predict exactly why and when it occurs. And it would be these like, short instances, these both sort of physical and non-physical forms of aggression, often because they're already in proximity, because they're mate guarding, that it, could simply be that they're feeding next to one another and all of a sudden the male will kind of lurch towards the female and displace or supplant her or chase her. Actually, chasing is a really one that you often see,
Hmm.
like,
They literally run after them and kind of wear them down.
yeah, yeah, chasing them. That's
Hmm.
another big one that just, sort of a number of these instances just popped into mind. And either, yeah, chasing until the sort of female will get away and maybe go amongst other baboons, and then the male will stop, or sometimes chasing to the point, and then once they reach or engaging in some kind of physical aggression.
Hmm. Now, what does deception look like in these animals, or do they deceive each other?
Mm, deception has a kind of long and I don't want to say necessarily fraught history in the study of animal behavior. It hasn't been looked at so much in baboons necessarily and primates as much as it has, for instance, in birds, right? There's a lot of
Hmm.
studies on deception in birds. It's also not my wheelhouse so much. So I don't think I can speak too much about deceptive behaviors in other primates.
Hmm. So you study conflict, and I'm thinking of deception as sort of under that umbrella. What might be under that umbrella that also would be of interest and relevance for you?
Well, I'm particularly interested in this notion that we often stereotype other animals based on characteristics that we assume to be true of all chimpanzees and all bonobos. And what I mean by that is that maybe you've heard that we have this assumption that like chimpanzees are conflict driven, they are aggressive, they are male dominated and violent. And on the other hand, bonobos are more peaceful and tolerant. And they've been called the sort of sexy hippie apes of the animal kingdom, that
Yeah.
they often reconcile using sex, that there's a lot of same-sex sexual behavior, and that chimpanzees and bonobos, especially when it comes to issues that are relevant to conflict, are often kind of dichotomized it. And I think this is actually really interesting thinking about human behavior, because I feel like we're using them to kind of show these different sides of human nature. That on the one hand, we can be this way, chimpanzee-like, and on the other hand, we can be bonobo-like. But what my research and that of my colleagues and many others is increasingly showing is that group differences in conflict and these other behaviors, reconciliation, et cetera, are far greater than species differences in those behaviors. In other words, you can have groups of bonobos who look a lot more chimpanzee-like when it comes to conflict, and you can have groups of chimpanzees who look a lot more bonobo-like when it comes to conflict. And so this sort of tendency to typecast, okay, like chimpanzees are one way and bonobos are another way. I think it really reflects this desire to understand these dual aspects of human nature, perhaps, but we should give the other animals the same credit that we give ourselves and say, well, both species can be both. Both species have both sides to them, just as humans have both sides to them. And to sort of say that we're all one, they're all one way or they're all another is a kind of biological essentialism that I think the field is starting to push back against.
Yeah, I've definitely heard this. People often talk about, oh, chimps, they go to war. They're dangerous. They're the violent ones. And bonobos, I don't know if there still is, but there used to be a popular menswear line called Bonobos.
Very
I mean, and it's very slick and sort of marketed to that sort of urban guy. So I can see how this is definitely something that's in our culture. What does the aggression, the violence sort of look like? Do they sort of whip each other up? Is it like going to war?
Oh, well, I mean, chimpanzees do have these intergroup. So there's a difference between sort of within group conflict and then conflict between groups. And chimpanzees have these border patrols where males will often patrol the borders of their territories, or sometimes they're even called like territorial raids, where they go into other chimpanzee territories. And we know that certain chimpanzee groups have engaged in lethal aggression between them, right? And this is sort of where a lot of the warfare stuff comes out of. But you also can see different forms of aggression, within the group. And I was mentioning some of the different ways that they can be aggressive towards one another throughout this conversation: chasing, biting, tugging, pulling. And in bonobos, though, it's interesting because I've actually had colleagues tell me who studied several populations of chimpanzees and bonobos in the wild, and they've told me, and I don't know how much this has been borne out by research, but so it's really anecdotal for now, but that when bonobos have conflicts, they can escalate really, really quickly, and they can become quite violent. Like you just see like a ball of bonobos who are wrestling and fighting. And I've often wondered if that's because, the chimpanzees, in part because perhaps aggression is on average a bit more common. I'm talking about real averages, general averages here, a bit more common in chimpanzees. But then they've therefore developed strategies to manage and cope with that aggression that maybe these groups of bonobos don't have at their disposal quite as much. And so conflicts can really kind of get out of hand and become not lethal, but like result in very, very serious life-threatening injuries more quickly than they would in at least some chimpanzee groups and populations.
So, Christine, how does reputation and personal space and that sort of place in the hierarchy all fit into conflict? Is it like we have with humans, or how does it take shape?
Often one of the ways that we determine an individual's rank in a dominance hierarchy is to look at conflict interactions and sort of what happens, who the victor was, or who subordinated themselves to who. And then we sort of will build a dominance hierarchy from there. So they're certainly related. But because there's also like coalitionary support, right? There can be these alliances that form. You always have to sort of corroborate those constructed dominance hierarchies with other observations that you make and with other forms of data that tell you what is going on.
So the space and kind of winning in conflict thing is so clearly related that you
Mm.
can mark out a hierarchy that's likely accurate based simply on those observations.
I mean, at least in the chimpanzees I've worked with, absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
What does one of those situations that you would use as an indicator look like?
Okay. So there is a monopolizable food resource somewhere, and the chimpanzees are. I'm actually thinking right now of like work done in sanctuaries where they're provisioned with food, and then there can be like a highly desirable food like sugar cane or a sweet potato or something like that
Mm.
that is in their enclosure, and you might see that a high-ranking male chimpanzee will engage in what's called a bluff display. That is a pretty incredible thing to watch. You might have seen it before. Their fur gets all raised. It's called piloerection.
Yep.
Humans actually have it too in the form of goosebumps. It's just you can't really tell because we don't have as much fur. But the chimps will get all puffed up, kind of. They look like they just got out of the laundry, and they'll start like running around, and sometimes they'll pull on things. They'll make a lot of noise. They'll shake things, right, to sort of amplify the effect. And other chimpanzees will often sort of cower, like get out of their way, right,
Hmm.
move out of the way, clear the area, and then those chimpanzees who have engaged in that dominance display will have privileged access to whatever food they wanted. And so it often sort of unfolds that way, like through intimidation
Yeah.
and power displays.
It's funny to hear you say this because it's not that different with people. I've
Mm,
seen one guy who when he wants something, he puffs out, he gets louder. He'll do what one of my guests calls brandishing anger, which is he'll just find something to get angry about or someone to get angry at just to kind of put people on edge. And then he kind of goes for what he wants. How
yeah.
different do you think the human tactics are from the ones that you've seen?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I hadn't really thought of it that way, but I agree that so much of it seems to be completely unrelated to the particular situation or dynamic at hand. It's all about making oneself as large and as loud as possible in a
Hmm.
space. And I find it really interesting also to see how I think there's a lot of variation in how individuals respond to that. So, I think some run away and they're like, that's terrifying. I've seen other chimpanzees in these moments of bluff displays that I was describing who basically just start grooming one another like
Oh yeah.
furiously, intensely. And I've always sort of thought about how what I do at a bar when a fight breaks out, I'm often like, I don't run away. I sort of pretend it's not happening, or I'm just like, do not want to engage at all. I don't wanna make eye contact.
Yeah.
I want to, like, focus on who I'm with and the beer that I'm drinking, and I'm like, that is not so I think that is also another interesting piece of it, that it sort of works differently on different individuals, and different individuals will have different ways of coping with the potential for aggression or what they see to be the potential for
Mm.
aggression.
Mm. And you mentioned grooming as a coping mechanism. This is something that you've actually experienced. What goes into grooming? What does it serve in the social sphere?
Yeah, I mean, grooming is a real the social currency of our close primate relatives. They
Mm.
spend a lot of their time grooming. You can also tell a lot about dominance hierarchies and construct dominance hierarchies based on who is grooming whom and for how long, and whether it's sort of reciprocated or not. It also serves a hygiene function. I mean, they're actually, moving little mites and things out of each other's fur. But there's been some pretty incredible studies looking at how grooming functions to solidify social bonds, and it has a deeply calming effect both on the recipient of the grooming and also on the individual who is grooming.
Mm.
So I find that really interesting that it affects both the groomer and the groomee. It has this sort of calming effect. Oxytocin, I'm sure, is involved, right? That's sort
Yeah.
of serving all of these bonding functions, and then it also, yeah, sort of serves as a kind of currency, I believe.
Yeah. And you've actually been in this dyad, right? I mean, what is it like?
Being groomed?
Yes.
Uh, so I have been groomed. I think at first I'm like a bit afraid because other animals can often be very unpredictable. I mean, if you know the individuals well, that can quickly subside, and then yeah, it can be quite relaxing. Well, the only time that I've ever been groomed was actually working with a captive
Okay.
monkey. And that's why I say I was afraid, because I think these were not particularly happy monkeys, and they were living in cages. But it can be, I think, in the same way that touch has this very calming effect in many ways when it's with someone that you trust. And, if when my mom plays with my hair, or, someone that you trust and love gives you a massage, it has this real relaxing kind of affiliative effect.
Yeah.
And I think that this can be true across primate species as well. I mean, we have such a shared evolutionary history that it wouldn't surprise me that I think that sort of experience, that shared experience, is kind of a testament to our close evolutionary relationship too.
Mhm. Yeah. Christine, it sounds like this was a very important experience for you. If you don't mind sharing, I mean, what precipitated this event for you?
So this was early in my career as a primatologist, and I write about this experience in the book because it was very formative for me in the kind of research that I absolutely don't want to be doing, both
Mm.
for ethical and scientific reasons. This was when I was a graduate student at Columbia. I was working at a primate cognition lab, and I was actually working there the summer before I became a graduate student, with singly housed rhesus macaques who were living at the New York State Psychiatric Institute up in Harlem. And the lab, it was a primate cognition lab, was studying their physical and social cognition. And so every day for about an hour, they would go to this other place where they would engage with computer touchscreens and get food rewards. And then we bring them back to their other cages. And I really hated going to work. It was very odd to go to a primate lab in the middle of New York City,
Yeah.
like, of all places, when there's so much life and animacy and energy happening all around you, and you get into this, like, very sterile environment where it smells like ammonia and chlorine, and the animals are clearly, I mean, they're living in tiny cages, and they're not even living with another group member. It's a deeply, distressing an uncomfortable environment, and I think that was very apparent to me immediately upon working there, so I hated going into the lab, but somehow I taught myself, and this comes back to sort of these norms and values that we learn in our scientific training, that, okay, this was important to becoming a good scientist. This was how you do good science. You do experiments, you study them in laboratories, you have total control over their environments. I knew it wasn't ultimately what I wanted to do. I really wanted to actually be able to understand their social behavior and their minds and their interests and their welfare. But it felt to me at the time like, okay, one stepping stone on the way to being able to do that. And there was an individual macaque in that lab who I formed sort of a special relationship with. And even though we weren't supposed to ever get too close to the cages, and, for the risk of them lashing out, and people have had their fingers bitten off, they've had their hair pulled. We weren't supposed to get very close, but he, MacDuff was his name, he would always put his body right up against the mesh cage whenever I walked by. And over time, I came to realize that this was a sign that he wanted physical touch. He wanted to be groomed, and so I would touch him through the mesh wires, and he would hold so still. He would hold still as a statue, I think for fear
Mm.
that I might stop. And this was his only form of social contact, and it's so deeply disturbing, it still haunts me, and I won't go into it too much, but I'll just add that in the book, the summer after I began research in that laboratory was the first summer that I ever did field work with wild monkeys, with
Mm.
wild Chacma baboons in South Africa. And it was after that and during that experience that I came to realize that working in a primate lab not only troubled me for ethical reasons, but I came to see how the science that I was interested in doing and the questions that I was interested in answering were impossible to answer in an environment that was so socially and physically depriving for the animals. And that has been a continued theme of my work lately is looking at both the ethical and the scientific reasons why studying animals in such conditions is not sound.
Hmm. Yeah, it sounds like a major cognitive dissonance. Like first you just have the issue of, I don't want to do this, I have to do this. But
Hmm.
then to tell yourself, I'm doing this for this reason. It's going to be
Hmm.
really important. But when you're walking through it to feel like, actually, this isn't going to take us where we want to go anyway. Like how do you deal with those messages in your head?
I will just say that I have a lot of students who are going through this very issue
Yeah,
right now because on the one hand, they are learning from the work of people like me and other animal studies scholars, and they're kind of giving permission to like think about other animals in a different way and think about science in a different way. And yet they're having to go back into the laboratory and do this invasive work. And I think they are experiencing a lot of emotional and cognitive dissonance. And the way that I dealt with it, as you already pointed out, there was sort of this like rationalization that was going on that, oh, this is the way that I'll ultimately get to the place that I will get to be able to study animals in the way that I want to study them. But after I think it was less than a year of working there, I just and after going into the wild, I could not do it anymore. I physically could not go into that lab. I know people who've like fainted, who literally like their bodies tell them they can't do this research anymore before even despite all of their rationalizations and attempts to justify it.
well, it seems to touch on some of the things we talked about earlier too, that these are incredibly social animals,
Yeah.
and that the environment is so forced. If things like personal space and the management of your space are something that's crucial to hierarchy and behavior and all of that, and then all of that's just tossed out the window. How valuable are these studies? Are there studies like this that have a particular utility in your mind?
I guess it always depends on the kind of question that you want to answer. But for me, I've always been interested in sociality.
Yeah,
And I don't believe you can study social cognition and social emotion in conditions that are so socially abnormal. I mean, it would be like, again, it really comes back to the question that you're interested in, because if you want to study how social relationships manifest in like incredibly confined conditions where there is so much that is controlled and manipulated. I mean, think about if you're interested in studying the social cognition of incarcerated individuals, then you would study them in an
sure.
incarcerated situation. If you're interested in that in this particular context in laboratory animals, then you should study them in this context. But if you're interested in it in a general way, like I'm interested in sort of how these behaviors evolved, then you want to study them in the most naturalistic conditions possible.
Wow. I'm so glad you brought up that example because the prison population thing is a theme in a lot of my interviews
Mm,
because the sort of pioneering work in the field of psychopathy is by Dr. Robert Hare, and he started in a prison population. And then people have tried to extrapolate that out to different environments, different situations, and things like that. But there's always this criticism of,
yeah,
well, this is people who are already caught. They've already been brought into this environment, and then they're living in this environment where they don't have the same sort of social leverage over people that they would if they were out among people. And so
yeah,
it's very hard to actually usefully extrapolate that out. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. You have something else? Sounds like you
yeah.
do.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point. And I, in the book, go through the most common methodologies for comparing the cognitive abilities of human beings with those of our closest living primate relatives. And those often come from studies that are comparing the cognition of captive, let's say chimpanzees who live in these highly deprived social and physical environments. They've often been separated from their biological mothers at birth. They're separated from the group
Yeah.
during testing. They're given human tasks and materials. And then you're comparing their performance with the performance of young children who will come into the lab for the day just to participate in the study, and they'll often be in the same room as their caregiver, and then they'll return home after the study. They're relatively autonomous. They're given human tasks and materials. It's just a completely unfair comparison. And the chimpanzees are highly unrepresentative of chimpanzees on the whole. But interestingly, the humans are also unrepresentative of human beings on the whole, not as unrepresentative as incarcerated individuals, as you were saying, but like these children are what psychologists call weird. They're Western
Hmm.
educated, industrialized, rich Democrats. They're like the kids of college professors. They're not representative of human psychology on the whole. In fact, they're actually highly unrepresentative. That's why they're weird.
Yes.
And yet studies like comparative cognition studies will then take these different samples and results from these samples, and then they'll draw general conclusions about species differences in social cognition. So in, say, the capacity for cooperation. So unsurprisingly, a lot of these studies show, okay, humans are exceptional cooperators. We're much better than chimpanzees at cooperating. We'll share food with unrelated group members when chimpanzees won't. La, la. It's like, but you haven't found a species difference. You've found an effect of different social and physical environments on cognition. And you cannot say something about a species based on a highly unrepresentative sample of chimpanzees and on a highly unrepresentative sample of children or of humans. But this is what we do a lot in comparative cognition research, unfortunately. And it's one of the many ways in which this bias of human exceptionalism has seeped into the science. We assume that a chimpanzee is a chimpanzee. It doesn't matter where they're from, but of course they're affected by their social and cultural and ecological milieu, just like we would be.
Yeah. You are really jogging my memory on some things now too. I'm so glad we're having this conversation because we talked before. I've done some animal research at 168th Street, but I also mostly did human subjects research. And
Okay.
like you said, the people are just total anomalies. I mean, what
Yeah.
kind of family can drop everything, fly to New York City, stay in New York for a few days, or even a couple of weeks with some of these interventions, and be there all the time? Mom is with the kid the whole time. Maybe dad is a New York hedge fund manager or something and has funded part of the research center to begin with. I mean, these families are just anomalies in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah.
They're not normal. So
Yeah.
it's very hard to say that is what normal life looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we need to be so attentive to these things. I mean, often, you read these scientific papers and the method section, you skip over the method section about the
Yes.
sort of participant demographics and all of that. But of course, they matter so much for the conclusions that get drawn.
Yes. Yeah. So what do you think is the answer then? I mean, you're doing more of the field work and now you're doing more of this awareness. You've written this book.
I should add, that the problem is not just true for research in my field as a primatologist and in comparative cognition. It's also true of biomedical research. We have in biomedical science right now a translation crisis, a replication
Hmm.
crisis, and there's growing recognition that those crises are in part due to the way that other animals are kept. And so we still rely on animal models in much of biomedical research science. And yet, I think, what is it? It's like 1 in 9 treatments that worked in an animal model actually translates to a human clinical
Mm.
outcome. Like, it's an incredibly low number. And I'll just say one thing. So 2 things. So one is that translation, that lack of translatability should lead us to sort of question, well, how are these animals being kept? The assumption in biomedical research is that the animals you're studying represent healthy biological and psychological norms because you want to be able to, study psychiatric disease and psychiatric illness and treatments and compare them against a sort of standard baseline condition. But how can a monkey or a rat or even a fish, living in these incredibly depleted environments actually be healthy biologically and psychologically? The neuroscientist Georgia Mason recently did a meta-analysis of rodent research facilities and studies. And she, is a neuroscientist and had been involved in this work herself. And she showed that the kind of standard housing for laboratory rodents should actually be considered an extreme stress condition.
Mm.
That actually, like, that is its effect on the data. And so all of these sort of control conditions and baselines actually should be considered an extreme stress condition. And that's, of course, affecting all sorts of things. We know that cortisol affects our thresholds for pain, our response to ketamine, our response to all sorts of different interventions. And so I do think that there's growing recognition of this bias in biomedical research and how it's not just a problem from the ethical standpoint, but it's also getting in the way of the science.
Hmm.
And the second thing I wanted to say is just that we often study these other animals and not human beings because we say it would be unethical to study human beings in this way, and that yet the animals are close enough to us, right, that they are similar enough physiologically or biologically to make them good models for human disease. But that very similarity should also lead us to question the ethics of it.
Mhm.
It's like the basis, oh, these animals can feel pain, they can be depressed, they can be anxious, and therefore we can study these things. But shouldn't that very ability for them to experience those things cast doubt on whether this is morally permissible? And I say that contradiction, it's a real contradiction,
Mhm.
is only possible in a culture dominated by human exceptionalism. And then the third thing I'll say really
Sure.
quickly is that our technologies are now allowing for all sorts of alternatives to animal models. And as those continue to rise, I mean, I think the solution is to move away from animal models in biomedical research. I don't think that can happen overnight. I think that this is already happening, and alternatives are available. And then I think when it comes to other kinds of research, just taking the least invasive approach possible, doing only observational work, studying animals in their natural environments, letting them live lives that are full of autonomy and value, and recognizing that is actually what is best for the science.
Well, Dr. Christine Webb, before we get to our last topic, for people who want to know more about what you're thinking on all these things, where should they look for you online?
My website, ceweb.com, and the book is The Arrogant Ape. It's Penguin Random House.
That's right. We'll put a link in the description for people to check out. And last of all, Christine, I'd like to know, what do you think that we as humans can learn from the animals that you've studied about conflict resolution and resolving it well?
Oh, I love this question. I wrote a paper years ago inspired by my time with the chimpanzees and other primates around how humans could rethink their conflict resolution strategies. And the paper was actually about going for walks with people,
Yeah.
and walking as a way of really dealing with intractable conflict. And there's all sorts of things that happen when you go for a walk with someone. You're in this cooperative side-by-side posture. You're not
Yeah.
competitive, like, facing one another. You're not making eye contact. You're also making all sorts of implicit decisions about where to go and how fast to walk. So actually your gait becomes synchronous, and you're moving at the same rhythm. And actually there's been a lot of research showing that behavioral synchrony can facilitate emotional and cognitive synchrony. We know that walking is really good for creativity. Anyways, I could go on about that study. It was that paper. It was such a fun paper to write, but it was inspired by the chimpanzees and the way that they managed to actually address conflict in the absence of these long, drawn out conversations at, the table. I
Yeah.
mean, there are so many effective ways that they manage conflict, not through talking it out, but through embracing, through getting on with their day, through moving together. They actually also do this amazing thing where they put their finger in the other chimpanzee's mouth. This is a way of reconciling, in addition to the other behaviors. I forgot to mention it earlier. You should try that with a loved one if you're ever in a fight. Just do it. Put your finger in their mouth. It's a trust thing, and it's hilarious, and it makes you laugh, and it sort of diffuses the tension right away. And so I think that's my greatest lesson, is that conflict resolution need not rely on language. It need not rely on long drawn out conversations where you're just digging deeper and deeper into the conflict, and then that conversation can actually become the new conflict at hand. But sometimes it's really good to do other activities together, to engage in other things that facilitate your relationship and create synchrony. And those behavioral expressions and activities can often be incredibly valuable to the conflict resolution process.
Well, it's a very special note to end on. Dr. Christine Webb, for the work that you do, for your book, for taking this time with me, thank you so much.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for watching my interview. To go even deeper on these ideas, you can watch my episode with Robert Greene on the laws of human nature, using the link in the description or the box on the screen.